I never imagined walking into my daughter's wedding feeling like a stranger in my own life. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom in Manhattan, the air smelled of fresh roses and expensive champagne, but it carried a weight, like it was pressing against my chest. The crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished floors, throwing shards of light that felt more like spotlights on a man about to be judged. My daughter, beautiful in white, waved at me with that nervous excitement only a bride can have. But the real storm was already there. Her husband's family. Her father-in-law, a titan of finance, whose name had appeared on more magazine covers than I could count, stared at me as if I were a misfiled expense report. His eyes were cold, dissecting, calculating. The whispers started immediately. Comments about my clothes, my background, my taste. I felt every word like a sting. My own son-in-law didn't say much. He just smiled politely like he was trying to bridge a chasm I hadn't even realized existed. But his family, they made sure I knew I didn't belong. I tried to keep my head high, shaking hands, nodding, laughing when expected. But inside, I felt the humiliation curling like smoke around my chest. Every sip of overpriced wine tasted bitter. Every polite greeting felt like a trap, and yet something deep inside me sparked, an ember I couldn't extinguish. I knew this wasn't the end of my story. The reception dragged on, each toast from her new family landing like a hammer on my nerves. They spoke in tones that were smooth, polished, dripping with superiority. One uncle, tall and sharp-suited, leaned close and murmured, "It's impressive you made it here." I smiled, tight-lipped, nodding, but the words tasted like ash. Impressive, as if my presence were some charity contribution, rather than a father standing proud of his daughter. I slipped away to the balcony, letting the night air hit my face. The city lights stretched below like a sea of gold and ambition. I could hear the laughter from inside, muffled but sharp, slicing through the cool breeze. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from that quiet, simmering rage. Rage mixed with clarity. They thought this was a game of money and influence. They were about to learn it was a game I could play too, but on my terms. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts, seeing names I hadn't reached in years. People who had power, knowledge, networks. And I smiled. The ember inside me flared. I wasn't just a guest at a party. I was a man with resources, with intelligence, with a plan that no boardroom in Manhattan could dismiss. And for the first time all night, I felt the humiliation lift, replaced by anticipation. They had underestimated me. They didn't know what I could do. The next morning I woke up in a hotel suite overlooking Central Park, the city buzzing below like a living heartbeat. My head still ached from the tension, the wine, the forced smiles. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about every insult, every sideways glance, every whispered, "Oh, he's..." Well, you know. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about respect, about dignity, about showing up in a world that measured your worth by your bank account and pedigree. I knew the conventional response, anger, confrontation, would play into their narrative. They wanted me small, quiet, embarrassed. But that wasn't me. I had built things before, quietly, patiently, in spaces where people doubted me. Now I was going to use everything I had learned, everything I had earned, to make them see the truth. Not publicly at first, not in their glossy magazines, but where it would matter most, where it could shake them from their ivory towers. I started making calls. Old allies in finance, law, media, tech, people who had once whispered about changing the rules, about overturning empires from behind the scenes. I sketched out a plan on the hotel notepad, each line a step toward reclaiming my power. I didn't need their approval, and I wasn't asking for it. My daughter deserved a family who would protect her, and I was not going to let arrogance and wealth masquerading as superiority harm her. By the afternoon, I was moving. Meetings lined up with people who had influence, connections that ran across borders, in companies and boards that the billionaire family would never imagine I could access. Every conversation felt electric, a confirmation that humiliation wasn't an end, it was fuel. By nightfall, the ember had become a fire. I wasn't just going to survive the insult. I was going to turn it into something monumental, and I knew, deep down, the moment would come when I would face them again. Not as the man they dismissed, but as the one they couldn't ignore. And when that moment arrived, it wouldn't be just a confrontation. It would be a reckoning. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a sleek conference room in downtown Chicago, the skyline cutting jagged silhouettes against the sunset. I wasn't here for a casual meeting. I was here to make moves that would ripple through industries, shake empires, and, most importantly, reclaim the respect I had been denied. My phone buzzed constantly, calls from old contacts, encrypted messages from allies who had long operated in shadows, financial tips that could tip the scales. Every detail mattered. Every decision was a step toward turning the humiliation I'd suffered into leverage they'd never see coming. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been treated like a nobody, a man without pedigree, without access. And now, here I was, plotting moves in the very systems they thought they owned. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with exhilaration. This wasn't revenge in the petty sense. It was justice, cold and calculated, with no room for error. By the end of the day, I had secured the first pieces: insider contacts in investment firms, confidential intel on key holdings, and a network of people eager to challenge the dominance of a family that had always assumed the world would bend to their whims. Every handshake felt like a small victory, every nod a step closer to the reckoning I envisioned. I could almost hear them now, smug in their mansions, believing the world ran on money and appearances. They had no idea that I had the power to unravel it all. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with precision, influence, and patience. That night, back in my temporary suite, I stared at the city below, the lights twinkling like stars caught in glass. I allowed myself a small smile. They had humiliated me in front of my family, but I was already drafting the blueprint to flip the entire narrative. In a few months, this story wouldn't just be about a father-in-law at a wedding. It would be about a man they underestimated, who reminded the world and themselves that respect, influence, and power could be claimed, step by deliberate step, by anyone willing to fight for it. And I would fight. The following weeks were a blur of boardrooms, private jets, and encrypted phone calls. Every day I carved out a network that cut across sectors: finance, media, tech, people who understood the value of leverage and timing. Each conversation was like placing a chess piece on a board no one else could see, preparing for a move that would leave the billionaires scrambling. I wasn't just playing to win, I was playing to teach a lesson. I watched my daughter carefully during this time. She had her moments of joy, but I knew she felt the strain of her new family's subtle coldness, their dismissive smiles, the way they treated her father like an outsider. I made sure she didn't see my anger, only my calm. I wanted her to feel that no matter what, her father was in control, and she could rely on me. That was my power in this world, my ability to protect her without ever making a scene. One evening, as I reviewed my strategy over a late-night glass of bourbon, the full scale of what I was about to do hit me. This wasn't a simple insult I could wipe away with money or an apology. They had publicly humiliated me, tried to diminish me in front of my family, my daughter, my own sense of dignity. And now, I had the means to show them that influence wasn't just theirs to wield. I made my first big move that night, a subtle but devastating acquisition that would, in a few months, directly impact one of their key investments. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was precise, and they would feel it. When the news finally hit, it would feel like an earthquake in their perfectly manicured world. The fire inside me was no longer an ember, it was a storm, and for the first time since that humiliating wedding, I felt something I hadn't in years: unstoppable. The morning the news broke, I was at my office in Chicago, a modest corner suite with a view of the river reflecting the dawn. I watched the notifications ping across my phone, one after another: industry insiders, financial analysts, even some journalists I hadn't contacted directly. My first move had landed, and it had landed hard. One of the family's flagship investments, a tech conglomerate they had publicly boasted about, had lost nearly 10% in market value within hours. The ripple was subtle, but to those who knew, it was seismic. I didn't smile immediately. I sat back, letting the tension build, savoring the way this quiet, invisible shift in power felt. It wasn't personal vendetta. It was justice. Their arrogance had assumed they were untouchable. That wealth alone equated to supremacy. They had dismissed me, laughed at my background, whispered about my limitations. P.O. And now, in the calmest, most surgical way, I was reminding them that influence was not inherited. It was earned, wielded, and sometimes taken. My daughter called later that afternoon. She was nervous, tentative, her voice caught between excitement and fear. "Dad, I saw the news. Is it true?" "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's true. But remember, this isn't about hurting anyone. It's about making sure the truth gets seen. You deserve a family who respects you, and I'm making sure they understand that." There was a pause on the line, and then a whisper of relief. I knew you'd do something. I just didn't know how." I leaned back, letting the city hum beneath me. This was only the beginning. They would feel the weight of my strategy more directly in the weeks to come, and each step would build toward a reckoning they couldn't ignore. By evening, I was already planning the next phase. Moves that would touch their media holdings, their international connections, their carefully curated public image. Every whisper, every email, every strategic nudge was designed to unbalance them. It wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. It was orchestration, a demonstration of power that wasn't loud or violent, but undeniable. That night, I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. They had humiliated me, made me feel invisible, tried to erase my presence. And now, quietly, methodically, I was rewriting the story. The fire inside me wasn't just burning, it was blazing, consuming every doubt, every insult, every whisper of disbelief they had ever cast my way. When the time came to confront them face to face, it wouldn't be about words. It would be about proof, precision, and the undeniable fact that I was a force they had underestimated. And I would make sure they remembered it for the rest of their lives. By the time I boarded the private jet to New York a week later, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in years. The city stretched below me, a jagged horizon of ambition, power, and money. The very world the family had tried to use as a weapon against me. But now it was mine to navigate on my terms. I wasn't here to make a scene, to yell, to confront them in the ballroom or the boardroom. That humiliation had already fueled every move I'd made, and each step had been quiet, precise, and deliberate. What was about to happen would be undeniable, and they wouldn't see it coming until the moment it hit. I checked my phone again, scanning the latest market movements, media leaks, and financial chatter. Each update confirmed the strategy was working. Their empire, vast and meticulously curated, was shifting under invisible pressure. Key executives were calling analysts. Analysts were scrambling for comment, and in private, their family was panicking. Yet publicly, they maintained their perfect composure, a glossy mask that I knew would crack under the weight of reality. When I finally stepped out into Manhattan, the familiar chaos of the streets hit me. The honking, the chatter, the smell of roasted chestnuts from street vendors blending with diesel and hot asphalt. I let it wash over me, grounding myself in the city that had always been a stage for ambition. I arrived at their penthouse unannounced, taking the elevator up in silence. By the time I entered, their perfect facade was already trembling beneath the surface. They didn't expect me. Not really. They assumed I was a man who could be dismissed, underestimated, and contained. But I was more than that. I had leveraged my knowledge, my network, and my patience into a force they couldn't quantify with money alone. And now, as I stood in the opulent living room, the city skyline stretching behind them, I felt the power in the room shift. Their smiles were tight, their voices clipped, their confidence faltering. I didn't need to speak at first. I let the silence do its work. Every glance, every calculated step I took across the marble floor was a reminder of the moves they hadn't anticipated. The subtle tremor in their eyes betrayed the fear they were pretending didn't exist. They had tried to humiliate me, to erase me from the story of my own daughter's life. Now, I was the one controlling the narrative, and it was intoxicating. Finally, I spoke, not to yell, not to accuse, but to state the truth simply, calmly, with undeniable authority. You thought this would be easy. You thought I would stay silent, humiliated, invisible. You were wrong. Everything you built, every empire you flaunted, every smile you used to hide your arrogance, it's all within reach. And now, you know it. The room went still. They were processing, calculating, trying to find a foothold. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. And in that moment I realized something deeper than revenge. This wasn't about money or power or even their humiliation. It was about proving, finally, that respect isn't granted by birth or wealth. It's earned, defended, and demanded. And I had done all three. The tension in the penthouse lingered like a heavy fog long after I arrived. I didn't rush the confrontation. I never had. The power of my presence alone was enough to unbalance them. Every luxury, every crystal glass, every expensive painting they had displayed with pride now felt hollow, a fragile shell that couldn't contain the reality I had created. I watched their expressions shift, tiny micro-reactions that spoke louder than any words. They were calculating, panicking, trying to regain footing on terrain I had already mastered. I walked over to the windows, letting my gaze sweep across the city. Lights twinkled like stars trapped in glass, and I imagined the billions of dollars in their empire flickering in tandem with those lights. I could feel the pulse of their anxiety, and it gave me clarity. Every investment they'd made, every media deal, every carefully curated public narrative, they had left openings, and I had exploited each one quietly, surgically, like a master strategist. "You know," I finally said, my voice calm but sharp, "humiliation is a strange thing. It makes you smaller if you let it, or it makes you unstoppable." I chose the latter. There was silence. Not the polite kind, but the tense, careful silence of people realizing that someone they underestimated is no longer just present, he is in control. Their arrogance had been their armor, but I had stripped it away without lifting a hand. I pulled out a tablet, showing charts and movements of their holdings, subtle shifts in stock, minor divestments that seemed random to outsiders but were anything but. The dominoes were falling, and they could see it happening in real time. Their empire, $90 billion worth of carefully constructed influence, was bending under forces they hadn't considered, and I was at the center of it. Not through brute force, not through spectacle, but through strategy, patience, and unyielding resolve. "You see," I continued, "this isn't about anger. It's about respect. You humiliated me in front of my family, in front of my daughter. You assumed wealth and name could erase dignity. I'm here to show you that dignity isn't taken, it's defended, and it can change the rules of the game entirely." For the first time, I saw the cracks in their composure. The father-in-law, the man whose stare had once made me feel invisible, now avoided my eyes. The smile that had been painted on their faces at the wedding, the one meant to dismiss me, was gone. In its place, calculation, fear, and the dawning realization that power, even when vast, can be vulnerable. I left the penthouse that night with no further words. There was no need. Every move I had made, every whisper of influence I had set in motion, had spoken louder than any confrontation could. They had underestimated me once. They would not make that mistake again. And as I walked onto the streets of Manhattan, the cool night air filling my lungs, I felt the ember inside me roar into a fire that could never be extinguished. This wasn't over. Not yet. But I had taken the first step toward rewriting everything they thought they owned. And when the final moment came, when every domino had fallen, I would be standing at the center, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as a man they could never forget. The following days were a delicate dance of invisibility and influence. I kept my public life calm, attending a few business meetings, walking my daughter to lunch, smiling when she needed it, all while orchestrating moves that the billionaire family couldn't see coming. They believed their wealth and networks were untouchable, that a man like me, an outsider, a father from a different world, could never infiltrate the structures they had built over decades. But I had learned early in life that underestimated people often have the sharpest edge. Every insult, every sideways glance, Every whisper about my place at the wedding had fueled me, refining my focus into something they couldn't anticipate: quiet precision. I began with their media holdings, small, seemingly insignificant acquisitions, public relations maneuvers that shifted narratives subtly. Articles questioning certain business decisions appeared overnight. Press releases hinted at instability in some of their more obscure ventures. The average reader wouldn't notice, but the analysts, the insiders, the executives, they did. And panic, subtle but unmistakable, began to ripple through the networks that they had relied on for so long. Meanwhile, I worked on building alliances in tech. I had contacts, old friends and partners, who owed me nothing, yet were eager to participate in a challenge that promised disruption. I organized private calls, laid out strategies, and watched their companies' supply chains, partnerships, and investments with a meticulous eye. Every vulnerability I identified became an opportunity. Every underestimated aspect became leverage. They were playing a game in which they assumed they were invincible, and I was writing the rulebook in real time. And through it all, my daughter became my silent witness. She wasn't fully aware of the scale of what I was doing, but she saw the shift in my demeanor, the confidence that replaced the humiliation I had felt at her wedding. We would have late-night dinners where she would ask questions about business, strategy, power, and influence. I explained in careful terms that respect could never be bought. It had to be earned, protected, and defended. I wanted her to understand, even in a world where people measured themselves by money and prestige, that character, intelligence, and resolve mattered more than all the zeros in someone's bank account. One evening, as she left to meet her husband, I stayed behind in the penthouse we had rented for the week. The city stretched before me in waves of gold and neon, a living map of the empire I was quietly unsettling. I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The humiliation from the wedding, the whispered comments, the cold stares, the sense of being invisible had been almost unbearable. And yet, without it, I might never have found the fire to take this far-reaching, methodical action. Pain, I realized, was sometimes the catalyst for transformation. Then came the first direct sign that my moves were working. A financial analyst called me in the early hours, voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Sir, the family's holdings, they're shifting. Their liquidity is under pressure, and some key partners are reconsidering commitments. It's subtle, but it's noticeable. Whoever is behind this is extremely strategic." I allowed myself a quiet smile. Subtlety was my ally. My goal was not to destroy recklessly, but to demonstrate power that was precise and undeniable. The beauty of the plan was in its silence. No flashy headlines, no dramatics, just calculated moves that slowly but irreversibly altered the balance. I also began to manipulate the social angle. The family's reputation as the epitome of refinement and control was carefully curated. I infiltrated events, sent subtle public suggestions, placed stories with the press that hinted at instability, tensions, and mismanagement. The whispers started in elite circles first, then spread like wildfire. By the time they realized the pattern, the perception of power that had shielded them was already cracking. Their social circle began to second-guess their judgment. Their friends questioned investments, and the tiniest seeds of doubt grew into noticeable uncertainty. Through it all, I remained calm, almost invisible. They didn't know me as the force behind the disruption. They were focused on maintaining appearances, unaware that the man they had humiliated in front of their entire family was orchestrating a silent coup across their empire. Every call I made, every investment, every carefully placed narrative was another step in reclaiming dignity and demonstrating that wealth without strategy or respect was fragile, easily disrupted. And then came the defining moment. A private meeting with one of the family's closest advisors, a man I knew had influence over multiple boards, who could subtly shift the family's operations if persuaded. I arranged a discreet lunch, presented projections, risk assessments, and opportunities. By the time the meal was over, I had secured an ally within their circle, someone who would quietly support my moves from the inside. I left the restaurant feeling a surge of satisfaction. This wasn't luck, it was skill, patience, and unwavering resolve. That night, As I returned to my temporary suite, I realized the truth of the situation. The humiliation from that wedding had transformed into unstoppable momentum. I wasn't just responding to insult, I was rewriting an entire power structure, one calculated step at a time. The ember inside me had become a controlled inferno, and by the time they fully recognized the shift, it would be too late to counter it. I poured a glass of bourbon, leaned against the window, and watched the city breathe below me. For the first time since that wedding, I felt complete satisfaction, not from revenge itself, but from mastery. The certainty that I was not just a man who had been humiliated, but a man who could reshape worlds quietly, strategically, and with unyielding authority. This was only the beginning. The next morning I woke before sunrise, as I often did these days. The city was quiet, still draped in darkness. The hum of distant traffic, a soft undercurrent beneath the occasional blare of a horn, or the rumble of a delivery truck. I sat by the window with my coffee, scanning the latest market shifts and media reports. Every indicator confirmed the trajectory I had set in motion. Their empire was under subtle, unstoppable pressure, and I was the unseen hand directing the momentum. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with a network of private consultants, lawyers, and financial experts I had quietly assembled over the past weeks. We weren't just watching the billionaire family. We were mapping their vulnerabilities, legal loopholes, strategic oversights, and investment gaps. Every minor detail I had once dismissed as trivial now became ammunition. Every insider connection I had cultivated became leverage. I realized with a surge of satisfaction that I was no longer reacting to humiliation. I was anticipating moves, preempting counteractions, and quietly guiding the outcome in my favor. I paused for a moment to think about my daughter. She had started to notice subtle changes in her in-laws' behavior. The once smug smiles, the careful tones, even the way they arranged themselves at dinner tables had shifted. I had been careful not to expose her to the magnitude of my strategy, but she sensed the power balance tilting. There was relief in her eyes, gratitude in her gestures, and a newfound pride that mirrored my own. I realized then that this wasn't only about proving myself to them. It was about safeguarding her world, demonstrating that no one, no matter how wealthy or influential, could undermine her father's love and authority without consequence. By noon, I was in Manhattan again, walking the streets with purpose. My destination was a small, discreet office building, housing one of the few independent media outlets I had cultivated relationships with. I met with the editor in a private conference room, discussing articles that would subtly expose the family's strategic missteps without ever naming them outright. The goal wasn't scandal, it was perception. The world would start to see cracks in what had seemed unshakable. Every report, every leak, every carefully framed headline was another push against the facade of invincibility they had so long maintained. By evening, I returned to the penthouse I had rented as my temporary base. I reviewed the day's progress and noted the subtle tremors I could already feel in the family's network. Board members were whispering, analysts were scrutinizing, and even some of their closest friends were beginning to question decisions they had once taken for granted. The humiliation I had felt at the wedding, the whispers about my place, the looks that cut like knives, had been transformed into a meticulous plan that was now visibly unsettling the people who had once made me feel small. Later that night, I allowed myself a quiet reflection. I poured a glass of bourbon, letting the warmth spread through me, and I thought about the journey from humiliation to empowerment. I remembered the sting of their judgment, the sharp edges of their laughter, the coldness in their eyes, and I realized that every slight, every insult, had been a step toward the strategy I was now executing flawlessly. Pain had been my teacher, patience had been my ally, precision had become my weapon. I glanced at my phone and saw a string of messages from allies confirming the next stages of the plan. We were now ready to escalate subtly, influencing international investments, shaping media narratives, and strategically undermining key holdings. The moves had been so quiet, so invisible, that the family still believed they were in full control. That perception would soon shatter. Finally, I called my daughter. Her voice was soft, tinged with excitement and relief. "Dad, I think they're starting to see it. "I can tell," she whispered. I smiled, proud of her perception and resilience. "Yes, baby. They're starting to understand that nothing you care about, or anyone you love, can be dismissed. We're just getting started." That night, I stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights like a constellation of possibilities. The ember of anger that had once consumed me had transformed into a steady blaze of strategy, foresight, and undeniable control. The humiliation that had driven me to action was no longer a weight, it was fuel. The raw material for a plan that would leave the billionaire family not just humbled, but permanently aware of their vulnerability. And deep down, I knew this. The story they had tried to write about me at the wedding, about a man out of place, lacking influence, lacking power, was gone. In its place was a new narrative, one where respect, strategy, and relentless resolve could overturn centuries of assumed dominance. The real reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would be complete. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in subtle disruption. I moved like a shadow, orchestrating shifts in investments, media narratives, and social perception, without ever revealing the hand guiding the change. The billionaire family remained confident, unaware that the man they had humiliated, the outsider at the wedding, the father-in-law they had sneered at, was now the architect of forces quietly unbalancing their empire. My strategy was simple, yet devastating in its precision. Leverage, timing, and perception. Every minor adjustment I made was calculated to create ripples that would ultimately become a wave they couldn't resist. I spent long hours in my office, reviewing spreadsheets, stock movements, and market forecasts, often losing track of time. Each line of data, each subtle fluctuation, became a piece of a puzzle they had never thought to check. I had allies planted strategically, people with influence in different sectors who could provide insights and opportunities. One contact, an old friend who had long been a kingmaker in media circles, whispered of pending reports that would cast subtle doubt on several of the family's investments. Another, a financier in Europe, hinted at the possibility of delaying key partnerships. Each piece, when combined, created an invisible pressure that I could control, measure, and escalate at the right moment. The brilliance of the plan, I realized, was that it wasn't visible. To the casual observer, it looked like coincidence, like the natural ebbs and flows of the market. But I knew better. Every subtle shake of their empire was the result of calculated decisions, precise timing, and relentless focus. The humiliation they had inflicted upon me at the wedding, the laughter, the dismissive glances, the whispered comments about my background, had transformed into fuel, sharpening my mind and my resolve. I made a point of keeping my daughter close during this period. She became an unwitting witness to the quiet storm I was orchestrating. I never revealed the full scale of my plans, but I let her see the calm control, the confidence, and the patience required to shift power without ever raising a hand. It was important to me that she understood that influence and respect were not given. They were earned, protected, and defended with intelligence, not brute force. One afternoon, I received a call from an investment analyst I had never spoken to before. The voice on the other end was cautious, careful, but unmistakably curious. "Sir, there's unusual movement in several of the family's holdings. Some are minor, almost imperceptible, but they've caught attention. Whoever is orchestrating this is extremely strategic. I don't know how, but it's precise, deliberate." I smiled quietly, letting the acknowledgement sink in. Subtlety was my ally. Chaos was theirs. I wanted them to feel the tremors without ever realizing the source until it was too late. I also began planting stories in elite social circles. The family's public image had long been curated to perfection. Untouchable, sophisticated, flawless. I didn't need to attack it directly. I simply nudged perception, introduced doubt, suggested minor inconsistencies in their decisions, and let whispers do the rest. The effect was slow, invisible, but powerful. Invitations were rescinded quietly. Dinner party dynamics shifted subtly, and their once ironclad social network began to wobble under the pressure of unspoken uncertainty. By nightfall, I would retreat to my temporary suite and reflect on the day's progress. The city sprawled beneath me like a living network of possibilities, each light representing a decision, a potential, a shift in momentum. I poured a glass of bourbon and allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the transformation in myself. The ember of humiliation that had once consumed me had grown into a steady, controlled blaze. I wasn't acting out of anger or revenge anymore. I was demonstrating mastery, foresight, and the power of a mind unshaken by insult. Then came the subtle confirmation of progress. A quiet message from one of their trusted advisors, sent through an intermediary. We need to reassess several partnerships. There are irregularities that require immediate attention. I read the message twice, savoring the understated victory. This was exactly the response I had anticipated. The first signs of doubt had infiltrated their inner circle, the first cracks in their seemingly unassailable empire. And they didn't yet know I had placed the pressure, orchestrated the strategy, or controlled the timing. That night, as I gazed out over the city, I thought about the wedding, the humiliation, the sneers, the whispers, the subtle ways they had tried to diminish me. And I realized something profound. Those moments had not broken me. They had ignited a focus, a clarity of purpose, and a meticulous plan that no wealth, no influence, and no arrogance could withstand. The ember inside me had grown into a strategic blaze that would consume their pretense of invulnerability. I called my daughter once more. Her voice was soft, tinged with awe and relief. "Dad, I can feel it. They're changing, aren't they?" I let out a quiet chuckle. "Yes, baby. They're starting to see that the world doesn't bend just because someone has billions. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And they're learning the hard way." She laughed softly and I felt a surge of pride. This was more than strategy. This was legacy. The lesson that no one, no matter their power, could diminish the people they underestimated. And so, as the city lights shimmered below me, I made a quiet vow. The final reckoning was coming. Every subtle move, every calculated shift, had been leading to a moment when they could no longer ignore me. The humiliation of that day at the wedding had been the catalyst. Now, months later, every whisper, every doubt, every subtle tremor I had orchestrated was converging toward the inevitable conclusion. I wasn't just reclaiming respect. I was proving a fundamental truth, that influence, intelligence, and resolve could overcome arrogance, wealth, and inherited privilege. And when the final moment arrived, the billionaire family would understand something they had never before. The man they had humiliated was the one controlling the story, and the story was far from over. By the time October rolled around, the tension I had been cultivating had reached a critical mass. The billionaire family still moved through their days with a polished exterior, attending galas, board meetings, and charity events. But beneath the veneer of control, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. I could see it in subtle ways: the hesitation in their conversations, the slight overcompensation in their gestures, the way they now double-checked every decision that once would have been automatic. Every move I had orchestrated, the financial pressure, the whispers in elite social circles, the carefully curated media narratives, was converging. The humiliation of the wedding had not been erased. It had been transformed into a strategic advantage. And now, months later, the full weight of that advantage was about to reveal itself. I woke early that morning, the city still cloaked in pre-dawn shadows. The hum of Manhattan was different at this hour, quieter, but the energy was unmistakable. I sat by the window, coffee in hand, reviewing the updates from my network. Stock movements, private communications, media leaks. Every data point confirmed the momentum. Their once impenetrable empire was wobbling under the precision of moves they could not trace. One glance at the numbers, one careful read of an analyst's report, and the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had anticipated every step, accounted for every reaction, and was orchestrating outcomes from behind the scenes. I allowed myself a small smile. It was intoxicating, not in the sense of arrogance, but in the clarity of seeing a plan unfold exactly as intended. Every whisper of humiliation from the wedding, the sideways glances, the insinuations about my worth, the subtle laughter at my supposed place, had fed a meticulous strategy. I had taken the pain of being underestimated and transformed it into action, patience, and leverage. Now those very forces were causing ripples that could not be contained. By late morning, I was in a private conference with a group of allies, consultants, financiers, and media strategists I had carefully cultivated over the months. Each of them played a specific role in amplifying the pressure I had been building. Some provided access to key networks, others to sensitive financial intelligence, and a few specialized in influencing perception in elite social and business circles. The goal was simple, yet profound. Create pressure points in every domain the family relied on: finance, reputation, partnerships, so that the foundation of their empire would feel fragile, unstable, and threatened. And it was working. During the meeting, we reviewed the latest developments. One of the family's flagship holdings had shown a minor but worrying shift in liquidity. An investment partner had quietly reconsidered terms, and several media outlets had begun publishing articles that, while subtle, suggested instability. The family would never connect the dots. Not yet. They were still too confident, too arrogant, too certain of their superiority. That confidence, I realized, had been their greatest weakness. They had assumed that money could shield them from scrutiny, that influence guaranteed loyalty, and that respect could be commanded rather than earned. I had learned otherwise. After the meeting, I took a long walk through Central Park. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves, damp earth, and distant street vendors. I allowed myself to reflect on how far I had come. The humiliation I had felt at the wedding had been sharp, almost unbearable. They had treated me as if my worth could be measured by pedigree and money, dismissing my achievements, my intelligence, and the love I held for my daughter. But that moment, as painful as it had been, had ignited something in me, a relentless focus, a clarity of purpose, and a determination to reclaim respect in a way they could neither ignore nor anticipate. That afternoon, I orchestrated the next stage of the plan. A meeting with one of their closest advisors had been arranged discreetly, under the guise of a casual lunch. The advisor, a man deeply trusted within their inner circle, had no idea that I had already influenced several of his peers. By guiding his perspective subtly, planting suggestions that seemed innocuous, I could ensure that the family's decisions would increasingly reflect the pressure I was exerting. I wasn't forcing their hand. I was creating circumstances where their hand would move exactly as I intended. The lunch went perfectly. I spoke casually, discussing industry trends and potential investment shifts, but every word was deliberate, every suggestion designed to guide outcomes without overtly signaling interference. By the time the meal was over, the advisor was already considering adjustments that would further destabilize the family's control. Small victories, yes, but each was a critical domino in a chain reaction that would soon become unstoppable. That evening, I returned to my temporary suite and reviewed the day's progress. My phone buzzed constantly with updates from my network: minor stock fluctuations, whispers in social circles, subtle shifts in media narratives. Each one was a testament to the effectiveness of careful, patient strategy. The family remained unaware of the full scale of the pressure being applied, still confident in their assumed supremacy. And yet, beneath that confidence, the cracks were widening. I called my daughter before bed. She could sense the change in the air, the subtle shifts in behavior from her in-laws. "Dad," she said softly, "I think they're finally realizing that you're not just my father. You're powerful." I laughed quietly. "Not just powerful, baby. Strategic, patient, precise. And yes, respected." There was a pause, and then she whispered, "I'm proud of you." Her words struck me in a way that no financial victory ever could. This was about more than humiliation or revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, teaching lessons about respect, and demonstrating that intelligence and resolve could reshape the dynamics of even the most entrenched power structures. That night, as I gazed out at the city, I understood something fundamental. The humiliation of that wedding had been a turning point, but it was not the end. It had been the spark. And now, months later, that spark had grown into a controlled blaze, precise and unstoppable. The billionaire family had assumed they were untouchable, that wealth and influence could shield them from scrutiny or consequence. They were wrong. I poured a final glass of bourbon, letting the warmth fill me, and reflected on the journey from insult to mastery. Every slight, every whisper of disrespect had been a stepping stone. Every moment of patience and strategy had been a deliberate move toward a reckoning they could not escape. The ember that had once burned with humiliation had become a fire of deliberate, unstoppable action. And when the moment came to confront them fully, it would not be anger or spectacle that brought the change. It would be precision, intelligence, and undeniable proof that the man they had dismissed was, in fact, the one controlling the narrative. The final act was approaching, and I was ready. By mid-November, the tension I had cultivated over months had begun to manifest in unmistakable ways. The billionaire family's once pristine world was showing the first visible tremors, subtle but undeniable. Their public appearances were meticulous, but the confidence that had once radiated from them now felt forced. In board meetings, decisions were slower, punctuated by hesitations and double-checking. Even their social circle, the friends who had once followed their lead without question, now began to question choices they had taken for granted. Every move I had orchestrated, from media narratives to financial nudges to whispered social observations, had converged to create a silent storm that they were entirely unprepared to navigate. I had learned long ago that true power rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, invisibly, shaping perception and outcomes before anyone realizes they've been influenced. And now, watching from my vantage points across the city, I could see the results unfolding. Stock fluctuations, minor public controversies, subtle shifts in partnerships, all the little dominoes I had set in motion were tilting precisely as planned. This was not luck or coincidence. This was strategy, patience, and deliberate action in response to the humiliation I had suffered months earlier at my daughter's wedding. That night had been a spark. This was a controlled blaze, transforming insult into influence. I spent the morning reviewing the latest reports from my network of allies. Each update confirmed my predictions. The family's advisors were beginning to recognize patterns, but they couldn't trace the source. Every whisper of instability, every subtle challenge to their authority, had been orchestrated to maintain the illusion of chance. They believed they were still in control, but control is only as strong as perception. And perception, I realized, was my greatest weapon. By early afternoon, I was meeting with one of my key contacts, a former financial analyst who had deep knowledge of hedge funds and investment vehicles tied to the family's holdings. Over coffee in a quiet Manhattan cafe, we discussed the subtle moves that would continue to erode their confidence without drawing direct attention. "They think they're untouchable," I said, my voice calm. "They don't realize the ground beneath them is shifting. The key is patience. Every small adjustment, every ripple, brings them closer to the point where they have no choice but to acknowledge reality." My contact nodded, understanding the gravity of the orchestration. We discussed timing, potential countermeasures they might attempt, and ways to anticipate their moves. The plan was no longer reactive, it was proactive, a precise sequence of actions designed to maintain the pressure while keeping the architect of the change completely invisible. The family had underestimated me. They had assumed wealth and pedigree alone were armor against scrutiny. They were learning, slowly and painfully, that strategy and foresight could outmaneuver both. Later that evening, I returned to the suite I had been using as a base of operations. The city lights glittered below like a constellation of possibilities, each representing a decision, a movement, or a ripple I had created. I poured a glass of bourbon and allowed myself to reflect. The humiliation of the wedding, the laughter, the glances, the whispered judgments had been a catalyst, but it had also been a teacher. I had learned to transform pain into patience, insult into strategy, and underestimation into leverage. Every subtle nudge, every invisible influence I had set in motion, had been a step toward reclaiming not just my dignity, but the respect the family had denied me. My daughter called later that night. Her voice carried the excitement of someone sensing change, but not yet fully understanding the extent of it. "Dad, I can see it. Things are shifting. I can feel it." I smiled, letting the satisfaction of both strategy and emotional triumph fill me. Yes, baby. They're starting to realize that the world doesn't bend to money alone. Respect isn't bought. It's earned, defended, and commanded through intelligence and action. She laughed softly, a mixture of awe and relief. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Her words hit harder than any market gain, any strategic victory. This was about more than finance or social influence. This was about proving, finally, that no one could diminish the people they love without consequence. As midnight approached, I reviewed the next stage of the plan. The moves would be more visible now, though still controlled. Minor public exposures, strategic partnerships shifting away from their influence, and subtle financial ripples that would force them to reassess long-standing decisions. The key was maintaining precision. Chaos was easy, control was difficult, and the reward for maintaining it was immeasurable. The family had assumed arrogance could shield them. They were learning that arrogance alone was fragile. I stood by the window, staring out at the city stretching endlessly beneath me. The ember of humiliation that had once consumed me had transformed into a disciplined, methodical fire. Every move, every whisper, every calculated shift had built toward a crescendo they could neither anticipate nor resist. The final act was approaching. The billionaire family, in all their wealth, power, and influence, had underestimated the man they had humiliated. And when the moment arrived, they would understand, fully and irreversibly, that underestimation carries consequences, especially when the man they dismissed had nothing to lose but everything to reclaim. The path from insult to power had been long and quiet, but now, months later, it was undeniable. I was no longer reacting. I was orchestrating. I was not just a father or a man who had once been humiliated. I was the architect of a reckoning that would be remembered. And the lesson was simple. Respect cannot be demanded by wealth, pedigree, or pretense. It is earned, protected, and when necessary, reclaimed with intelligence, patience, and unwavering resolve. And the reckoning, I knew, was imminent. By early December, the billionaire family's carefully curated world was beginning to unravel in ways they could no longer deny. Their public appearances were meticulous, their smiles forced, and their conversations measured with unprecedented caution. I had orchestrated it all to be subtle, to be invisible, so that each ripple of disruption would appear accidental. But the pattern was undeniable to anyone paying close attention. The empire they had built on arrogance, wealth, and perceived invincibility was showing cracks, and the humiliation they had inflicted upon me months earlier was the spark that had ignited this meticulously controlled upheaval. I began the day early, waking before sunrise to review the latest financial movements. Several of their flagship holdings had experienced minor but significant shifts, subtle enough not to trigger panic in the wider market, but sufficient to unsettle those within their inner circle. Partnerships that had once seemed secure were now re-evaluated. Advisors who had previously been loyal without question were beginning to suggest caution. The once unshakable confidence that had defined the family was slowly eroding under the weight of strategic pressure I had applied from behind the scenes. By mid-morning, I was on a conference call with a network of international contacts, bankers, investment analysts, and media strategists, all carefully aligned with my objectives. The conversation was precise, focused on reinforcing the subtle shifts that had begun to manifest. We discussed ways to influence perception, to gently pressure stakeholders, and to continue applying financial leverage without creating overt disruption. Every move was deliberate. Every suggestion, every nudge, was designed to appear organic while furthering the broader objective, destabilizing the family's perceived invulnerability, and demonstrating without a public confrontation that I had control. After the call, I walked through the streets of Manhattan, letting the energy of the city ground me. The smell of roasting chestnuts mixed with diesel, and the crisp scent of winter air filled my lungs. I reflected on how far I had come since that fateful wedding, when my presence had been dismissed, my achievements belittled, and my dignity subtly stripped in front of my daughter. That humiliation had been a crucible, forging a new kind of focus within me, a combination of patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to anticipate and manipulate systems in ways the family could never have imagined. Every slight, Every whispered judgment had been transformed into fuel for a plan that was now reaching its crescendo. By afternoon, I arranged a discreet meeting with a key figure in their social network, someone whose opinions subtly influenced the family's reputation. Over coffee in a quiet, unassuming cafe, I framed the conversation as casual industry discussion. Yet beneath the surface, every point I made nudged perception, sowed doubt, and reshaped expectations in ways that would subtly undermine their confidence. This was not confrontation. It was orchestration. Every move was invisible yet powerful, building toward the moment when the family would be forced to acknowledge the extent of the influence I had cultivated. Later that evening, I returned to the suite I had been using as a base of operations. The city glittered below, lights reflecting in the frozen glass of skyscrapers like tiny constellations. I reviewed updates from my network, minor financial shifts, media narratives, and social whispers, all precisely aligned with the strategy I had devised months earlier. The family was beginning to feel pressure in multiple dimensions simultaneously. What had started as subtle tremors in their empire was now evolving into noticeable instability, yet the true orchestrator remained invisible. I called my daughter before bed. Her voice was filled with awe and relief. "Dad, I think they're realizing. I can see it in them. They're worried." I smiled, proud of both her perception and the quiet emotional victory this represented. "Yes, baby. They're starting to understand that arrogance and wealth alone don't guarantee respect. Every empire has weak points, and every assumption of invulnerability can be challenged. They're learning that lesson now, quietly but undeniably." She laughed softly. "You've turned everything around. I can't believe how far you've come." Her words resonated deeply. This was not just about financial or social power. It was about reclaiming dignity, protecting those I loved, and proving that intelligence, strategy, and patience could overturn even the most entrenched arrogance. That night, as I stood by the window watching the city, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The humiliation I had endured at the wedding, the cold stares, the laughter, the dismissive whispers, had been transformed into a catalyst for action. I had turned insult into influence, weakness into leverage, and invisibility into control. The ember of humiliation that once burned in me had become a calculated blaze, precise, unstoppable, and invisible until the moment of reckoning. I poured a glass of bourbon, savoring the warmth, and contemplated the final stages of the plan. The family was beginning to feel the pressure across financial, social, and media domains, but the true reckoning had not yet arrived. That moment would be deliberate, undeniable, and designed to demonstrate the consequences of underestimating someone who had been dismissed and humiliated. Patience had been critical. Strategy had been critical. And now, as the empire trembled in ways they could not yet fully perceive, the final act was approaching. I realized with quiet satisfaction that this journey had been about more than revenge or power. It had been about proving a fundamental truth. Respect cannot be demanded by wealth, pedigree, or pretense. It is earned, defended, and, when necessary, reclaimed with intelligence, patience, and unyielding resolve. The family had believed themselves untouchable. They had underestimated me, and in the coming days, they would understand, completely and irrevocably, that the man they had humiliated was now the force shaping their world. The city stretched below me, a living map of possibility, and I felt the ember within me roar into a controlled inferno. Every subtle shift, every careful manipulation, every strategic decision had led to this point. The billionaire family had built their empire on arrogance and the assumption of invulnerability, and they had failed to account for the quiet power of a man underestimated. Their reckoning was imminent, and when it arrived, it would not be loud, it would not be theatrical, it would be precise, undeniable, and irreversible. I sipped my bourbon, letting the warmth anchor me in the moment. The journey from humiliation to control had been long, deliberate, and unyielding, and as the city lights shimmered beneath the winter sky, I knew with certainty that the culmination of my strategy was near. The final act was coming, and when it unfolded, the world, and the family who had tried to diminish me, would witness, finally, the power of a man who had refused to be invisible, underestimated, or humiliated. By mid-December, the billionaire family's empire was wobbling under pressures they couldn't fully trace. Every subtle maneuver I had orchestrated, financial shifts, media narratives, social whispers, had converged to create a web of influence that touched every aspect of their carefully curated world. Their smiles at public events were tight, rehearsed. Their private conversations were cautious, weighed with indecision. The arrogance that had once made them untouchable was replaced with uncertainty, the faint tremor of awareness that control was slipping. Every move I had made over the past months, the silent recalibration of their empire, had been deliberate, precise, and invisible until now. I spent the morning in my temporary Manhattan suite reviewing the latest reports. Stock portfolios showed subtle but undeniable shifts. Some partnerships had quietly faltered, and even long-standing social connections were reconsidering loyalties. I allowed myself a rare smile, savoring the culmination of months of patient strategy. The humiliation of the wedding, the sneers, the dismissive glances, the whispers questioning my place, had been transformed into leverage, influence, and undeniable authority. Every slight I had endured had sharpened my resolve, focusing my mind like a laser. By late morning, I convened with a small group of trusted allies. We reviewed the final phases of the plan, ensuring that each action would hit its mark with precision. The strategy was no longer subtle. It was ready to be visible, undeniable, a crescendo that would force the family to acknowledge the source of their destabilization. It was time for the culmination of every careful move, every whisper, every financial nudge I had executed. The humiliation that had once silenced me would now echo back to those who had inflicted it, not as spectacle, but as undeniable proof of control, intelligence, and influence. In the afternoon, I reached out to one of the family's advisors under the guise of a casual discussion about industry trends. Every suggestion, every analysis I provided, nudged them into decisions that aligned with my strategy. It was subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, but each action further undermined the family's sense of invulnerability. Their arrogance, once their armor, had become their vulnerability. They had assumed wealth, influence, and legacy would protect them. They were learning, slowly, that a man underestimated could dismantle perception, shift alliances, and redirect outcomes without ever appearing to act aggressively. Later, I met with my daughter for dinner. She had noticed the subtle change in her in-laws, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the way their carefully constructed confidence seemed fragile. "Dad," she said softly, "I can feel it. They know something's happening, but they don't know what." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "Exactly. They're starting to understand that influence isn't about wealth alone. They underestimated the man they humiliated. That mistake is theirs to live with." Her eyes glimmered with relief, pride, and awe. She saw not just the results, but the quiet strength, patience, and intelligence that had brought me here. By evening, the stage was set for the final act. Every financial, social, and media domino I had positioned was in place. The family would feel the culmination of pressure in ways that were undeniable yet perfectly orchestrated. I didn't need to confront them with anger or spectacle. The proof of my influence would speak louder than any words could. Every board meeting they attended, every social interaction, every media mention would now carry the subtle mark of my strategy. The humiliation they had once inflicted on me would now be mirrored in the awareness of their vulnerability, the realization that the man they had dismissed had quietly taken control of the narrative. I spent the night reflecting, the city lights stretching beneath me like a living map of all I had orchestrated. The ember of anger that had once consumed me had become a controlled blaze of strategy, foresight, and emotional mastery. I allowed myself a final quiet moment of satisfaction, not from revenge itself, but from the knowledge that I had reclaimed every ounce of dignity, influence, and respect that had been denied me. The humiliation at the wedding had sparked a transformation that had grown into a calculated, unstoppable force. When the moment arrived, it would not be dramatic. There would be no shouting, no public spectacle. The billionaire family would feel the shift across every domain they relied upon. Their empire, their image, their influence. And in that quiet, undeniable reckoning, they would finally understand the full measure of the man they had humiliated. I had turned pain into precision, insult into strategy, and invisibility into power. I poured a final glass of bourbon, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and thought of my daughter, my reason for enduring the humiliation and orchestrating the strategy. This was about her, about proving that no one, no matter their wealth, pedigree, or arrogance, could diminish the people they loved without consequence. The lessons were clear. Intelligence, patience, and calculated action could overcome arrogance, and respect could never be assumed. It had to be earned, defended, and when necessary, reclaimed with precision. The final stage was imminent. Every domino had been set. Every whisper had been planted. Every subtle adjustment had been accounted for. And when it all converged, the billionaire family would confront the undeniable reality. The man they had humiliated, dismissed, and underestimated was now the one controlling the outcome, and there would be no escaping it. The moment was near. The reckoning was near. And I, calm, collected, and precise, was ready. The day had come. Months of patience, strategy, and quiet orchestration had led to this moment. I awoke early, before the city stirred, letting the winter sunlight filter through the blinds. The skyline of Manhattan looked indifferent, but beneath its glittering surface, the culmination of my work was about to unfold. Every financial adjustment, every media ripple, every subtle social shift I had set in motion converged today into a reckoning the billionaire family would never forget. I reviewed my final notes in the quiet of the suite, checking timelines, projected reactions, and contingency plans. Every detail mattered. Overconfidence had been their downfall. My patience and precision would ensure that every domino fell exactly as intended. The family still believed they controlled the narrative. They had no idea that the man they had humiliated, the father-in-law they had dismissed at the wedding, was now the one directing the forces shaping their world. And the satisfaction of that realization, though not yet theirs, was nearly intoxicating. I arrived at the family's corporate headquarters in mid-morning under the pretense of a routine meeting. Security and staff greeted me politely, unaware of the storm I carried with me. The lobby, grand and polished, had once symbolized their unassailable power. Today, it was just a stage. I walked through it deliberately, letting the weight of my presence ripple subtly through the room. The meeting itself was calm, professional, and controlled. I discussed industry trends, investment opportunities, and partnerships with the precision of a man who knew exactly what would unfold. Yet beneath every word, beneath every chart, was influence. Subtle gestures, strategically placed facts, and carefully framed projections guided decisions, nudged behaviors, and reinforced the pressure I had applied over months. They didn't realize it yet, but I was directing the outcome of every conversation, every consideration, every calculation in that room. By mid-afternoon, the first visible effects began to emerge. One of their advisors, who had been a loyal pillar of confidence, hesitated mid-presentation. Analysts began questioning assumptions in real time. Minor stock adjustments were made quietly, reflecting the subtle shifts I had orchestrated weeks earlier. The billionaire patriarch, the man whose cold stare had haunted me at my daughter's wedding, sat quietly, the veneer of control faltering. He knew, on some level, that something was changing, but he could not yet trace its source. I observed calmly, silently, letting the tension build without interference. The humiliation they had once inflicted on me, the sideways glances, the whispered comments, the sense that I did not belong, was now mirrored back through subtle recognition of vulnerability. They were feeling the consequences of underestimating someone they had assumed powerless, and the realization was breathtaking, quiet, and complete. Later, I stepped into a more private setting with my daughter. Her eyes reflected relief, pride, and awe. "Dad," she whispered, "it's happening. I can see it in them." I nodded, holding her hand. "Yes, baby. They're learning what I've known all along, that respect can't be demanded through wealth or arrogance. It's earned, defended, and, when necessary, reclaimed. They will never forget it." Her smile was quiet, filled with the satisfaction of witnessing justice executed not with anger or spectacle, but with intelligence, patience, and strategic mastery. By evening, the family's inner circle was fully aware of the changes. Subtle alliances had shifted, investments were being reconsidered, and social networks were no longer unquestioningly loyal. The empire, meticulously curated for decades, had been quietly recalibrated under my guidance. Every whisper of doubt, every strategic nudge, every financial and social adjustment had brought them to this point. The humiliation I had endured months ago had been the spark that ignited this meticulously controlled blaze. I allowed myself a moment to reflect as the city lights shimmered below. The journey from humiliation to absolute strategic control had been long, deliberate, and precise. I had transformed insult into influence, doubt into action, and invisibility into power. The ember of humiliation had become a fire of intelligence and foresight, a controlled blaze that ensured the lesson would be understood and remembered. Finally, as I left the building that evening, the patriarch of the family approached me. His smile was tight, forced, and hesitant, a mirror of the confidence that had once been unshakable. He extended his hand, and I took it calmly. No words were necessary. The look in his eyes, a mixture of realization, respect, and unspoken acknowledgement, said everything. I had reclaimed my dignity, secured my daughter's respect, and demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and strategy could overturn arrogance and wealth alike. Walking through the streets of Manhattan that night, the cold air crisp against my skin, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The humiliation of the wedding, the moment that had once made me feel invisible, was now nothing more than fuel that had carried me to this point. The billionaire family had learned, quietly but irrevocably, that underestimating someone who had been dismissed comes with consequences. And the world, too, had witnessed the subtle but undeniable power of precision, patience, and unwavering resolve. I poured a glass of bourbon in the quiet of my suite, letting the warmth anchor me. The ember inside me had burned steadily, transforming into an inferno of accomplishment and vindication. The story that had begun with humiliation had ended with mastery. I had not just survived the insult, I had turned it into an empire of influence, respect, and undeniable authority. And as I looked out at the city that had witnessed every step of this journey, I knew with absolute certainty, the lesson was complete. The billionaire family had been humbled not through anger or spectacle, but through quiet, deliberate strategy. Respect had been reclaimed, influence had been asserted, and the man they had humiliated at a wedding had emerged victorious. Not with noise, but with precision, patience, and undeniable mastery. The world was still moving below, oblivious to the subtle shifts that had taken place. But for those who mattered most, the lesson was clear. Never underestimate the man you dismiss.